Hello everyone, this is Grandmaster Pascal Charbonneau, and this is the game of the day for day number 4 of the Chess24 Legends of Chess. Today we're going to look at the game between Magnus Carlsen and Boris Gelfand that was played in the very first game of today. It was a tough day to choose, I would say, because there were a lot of wins, a lot of interesting games today, but a lot of the wins tended to be a little bit more one-sided than on some of the other days. I picked this game, first of all, because I asked in a chat, a few people, what should be the game of the day today? And this was the one answer that I got. And so I decided, let's cover this one. I don't think I've done a Magnus game so far in this event, so it kind of makes sense. This game is interesting because we will see Boris Gelfand play an opening that is normally played as black by Magnus Carlsen himself. And so it's always interesting, there's a bit of a debate among players of all levels really about whether it's unpleasant to play an opening that you play yourself or whether it's something that you welcome because clearly you've studied it and you know it very well. On the other hand, the flip side of it is that for someone like Magnus, he may not want to show what he thinks are the real problems with the opening that he plays as black. And so it's always a little bit of a tricky thing how you face it. And in this case, Magnus did go for a pretty topical line, one that he's had games with black a lot. And so it's always interesting to see how these games go. So without further ado, let's get started here. So it starts with e4. Gelfand plays c5. And so we get into an open Sicilian. Interesting that Magnus decided to play d4. He also sometimes plays the Rossolimo. I mean, he can play anything as you've seen in these events. But today he goes for the open Sicilian. And I think he might have been a little bit surprised by Gelfand's choice to play the Sveshnikov or the Pelican, depending on how you call it. This opening was not always Magnus's number one choice, but it did become really important for him in his match against Fabiano Caruana, where they had many games in this variation. Knight b5, d6. And the Sveshnikov has kind of changed in the last few years. When I was more active, pretty much you could count on facing bishop g5 probably in 90% of your games here. Now I would say bishop g5 is maybe less than 50%. And a lot of attention is turned to the move which is played by Magnus here, which is knight d5. And this move was, I guess, became popular in large part because it was the move that Caruana played against him in that match. And back in the old days, it was considered to be less dangerous for black than the main lines, which, start with bishop g5, a6, knight a3, b5. And then white has a choice between playing against this pawn structure with bishop f6, gf, or play knight to d5, which are slower lines, and then we get positions like this. And there's a ton of theory. There's a ton of theory in these variations, of course, beyond the scope of just this game of the day. But it's definitely interesting to see that the fashion has completely changed in favor of this knight d5 move. And a lot of the openings that are popular today are lines that give more of sort of less direct play, right? Like the things that the long Najdorf variations with bishop g5, like those things that are too easy for a computer to analyze, I've kind of taken a bit of a side are becoming more of a sideshow, while the more positional variations that where there's a lot of possibilities for both sides, understandably have become more popular. And things like the London system, like who would have thought that even as players got better over the last several decades, that an opening like the London system would become really popular when it was considered innocuous. Like you would have thought that openings that are innocuous are going to be even more innocuous as time passes. So I've always found these kind of trends and fashion in chess to be fascinating. So black takes on d5, ed. And now Gelfand plays knight e7. That's actually an interesting decision. Knight b8 is the old main move, and both knight e7 and knight b8 have been played in a ton of games, but knight b8 was considered a more solid move. Magnus in his match against Fabiano did play both knight b8 and knight e7, but they do lead to slightly different play, because on knight b8 it used to be that you would play c4 with white, and then after a6 you go back to c3 and you play something like bishop e2, castles, bishop e3, f3, and white eventually tries to play for c5. But then in this match with Fabiano, a plan with a4 started to be popular, and since then it's become kind of all the rage. The knight actually goes back to a3 and can come to c4, and you try to play on the queen side with a5, bishop e3. It's a little bit different. The pawn structure is not completely different, so there are some similarities, but it's a different plan. Knight e7 is a little bit different because knight e7 can be met by c4, and the difference is that because the knight is on e7, the bishop is not protecting d6, and black is just one move further away from castling, because they need to spend, if the knight's on b8, they can play bishop e7 and be ready to castle. With the knight on e7, after we play c4, it creates this somewhat awkward idea of playing queen a4. And in fact, it's possible to play c3 as well, which c3 really doesn't disguise. The only point of c3 is to play queen a4. It's also a possible move. And when queen a4 gets played next move, it's a little bit awkward to defend against knight takes d6 mate. So the knight has to move again here, and there are a couple of moves, but knight g6 is the one that's played in this game. Knight f5 is a move that's also theory, but less popular these days than knight g6. So knight g6, queen a4. It's a bit of an unusual, if you've never seen this variation, it looks a little bit weird, but it does make sense, because once you see bishop d7, which is forced, you can't play queen d7, for example, because of knight c7 check, an old style trick. Bishop d7, white has this move queen b4, and it's awkward. The queen is surprisingly well placed on b4, attacking the d6 pawn. So black plays queen to b8. That's one of the moves. There was actually a game of Magnus's with black, right? So if you look at the database at this position, you will see that there are a number of Magnus Carlsen games, among others, but notably Magnus. And in this position, he has played once bishop f5, but the main move is queen b8, as in this game. And now white continues with sort of original play. All this has been played before. Again, Magnus with black normally. h4. So the idea is just to try to play h5, which, given that this knight on g6 doesn't have a lot of squares, it's a little bit awkward to meet. And so black plays h5. There were some games, there's a much more forcing variation. After h5, the knight can't come back to e7 because of knight takes d6, right? So for example, bishop e7, h5 would be really bad. The knight is actually forced to go here, right? So it's a really bad square. So a6 has been played to try to get this knight to move away. This way, we could meet h5 by moving back to e7, for example. But on a6, there's a forcing variation, h5, which attacks the knight. And then these knights get traded one for the other. The white rook has a pin on the h-pawn, so black can't play this. They normally play f takes g6 here, then pawn takes b5. And there have been some games here, but it looks like, at least my understanding of it, is white is better. That this sort of weird pawn structure favors them, because on the queen side, they have really a long-term advantage. And on the king side, it's not exactly clear who's better. So it seems like black is considered to be struggling here a little bit. Endgames would be bad for black in general. So instead, black plays h5. Now Magnus plays bishop e3. Now, it's interesting, Gelfand chose to play b6. And b6 is not the most the most popular move. And Magnus has had this position in the past, and he's played a6. And the play could continue knight c3, which is more or less forced. And then a5 has been played. There was a game, I believe this was a Magnus game against Fabiano. a5, queen b3, a4, queen to d1, and bishop e7, g3, queen c8, bishop e2. I'm just showing a segment of a game between Magnus and Fabiano. And here I think the conclusion is that instead of c5 as Fabiano played, if he had simply castled, white is a little bit better in this position. So, however, in another game, some time later, Magnus played, instead of the move a5, he played f5. This is against Jordan van Forest, I believe in Wake on Zee. I forget what tournament it was in. And then it was a really messy, complicated game. Van Forest castled queenside because here he didn't like, I guess, playing g3 and castle on the king side with black already storming. But it's a very double-edged position, and it is curious. It would be interesting to know what Magnus would have played if Gelfand had continued to play in Magnus Carlsen fashion, so to speak. You guys may know this story. There was a famous match. I believe it was Argentina. Was it Argentina against the Soviet Union, where they were playing on 4 boards, or maybe even 6 or 8. I haven't heard this story in about 20 years, but so bear with me. But the basic of it is that the Argentinian side decided to try a weird strategy of copying. So, board 1 is white, board 2 is black. So they would kind of wait for white to make a move and then make the white move on that board. And then black would wait for that side to play and then make a move on the other board. So we had a situation where they had all these boards with exactly the same position, with the idea that at some point, they can draw the match if they don't lose on time, of course. But, this is not... and these were all strong players on both sides. But anyway, it's a curious thing to know what your opponent would do given that situation. So so f5, and we can also look at g3, for example, and bishop e7, and then knight a4 is an interesting move, for example, trying to play knight to b6, f4, and it's just mayhem on the board. So there's a lot of possibilities here that could be explored. But Gelfand chooses b6, which is interesting. And now possibly both players are kind of on their own, although Magnus may have looked at this before. So he plays bishop e2, probably the most natural square for this bishop. Bishop e7. So he's attacking the h4 pawn in some cases. g3 protects it. And now he plays a6. And a6 is connected with a pawn sacrifice, and it's very interesting. And probably worth playing again. Actually, it was Gelfand can't really blame the first few moves for what happened later in this game. So it was an interesting possibility. But I do think that the move f5 right away would have been an interesting alternative. And I kind of like it better than what happened in the game because I feel like committing himself. So in the game, he plays a6, knight c3, b5, which is basically a pawn sacrifice because eventually that pawn will be taken. And I'm wondering whether playing f5 first with, already sort of scary ideas of playing f4. I mean, whether it's a threat, maybe not, but it's definitely in the air. And I thought it would lead to interesting play at least. And, if white castles queenside, then already the sacrifice of a6 and b5 seems a little bit more scary now that the king is on this side, committed to being on the queen side. So to me, f5 is an interesting move, and I do wonder what Magnus would have played here. What did I look at? Bishop g5 as a possibility, but here a6 still seems okay. Because on bishop e7, you can actually play king takes, and that position seems fine, even though the king's in the center for now. So, I think f5 would have been an interesting move, maybe for next time. And as I go through the games of the day, I always try to give a bit more detailed of an overview of the opening than maybe you would expect, just because I feel like everyone's always curious about understanding what happens at the very beginning. So Gelfand plays b5. Magnus takes it. Now the pawn is fixed here. He doesn't have to take it right now, and understandably he doesn't, because it does walk into a pin, so he doesn't really want to take it. That pawn is not going anywhere, right? White is basically going to be able to take that whenever they want. The question is, will black be able to drum up a bunch of counterplay on the king side? So Magnus castles, black castles, and now interestingly, Magnus goes after the h5 pawn, and it's understandable because he knows that the b5 pawn is a static weakness that's not going to go away, and he decides to take this one. And what's good about taking the h5 pawn is that f5 is not possible for now because that knight is hanging. And in some cases, you know, bishop takes g6, even though it gives the bishop pair, this pawn structure that black would get with doubled pawns here would be a pretty bad pawn structure. So he plays bishop d8. A reasonable move. Knight e4. And now he plays bishop f5, which is sort of a second pawn sacrifice. I wanted to look, I think, instead of castling. So we looked at f5 first, right, before playing this a6 b5. This moment also, I'm curious what Magnus would have done on f5. Playing without giving the h5 pawn, because I wasn't entirely sure whether it was necessary to give that pawn up. It wasn't bad per se, but I did wonder whether that would be interesting, because even if you castle next and let him play bishop takes h5, then at least in that position, like let's say we play a3, which is actually a move that the computer always likes because it defends the queen for some reason, we can castle bishop h5 and play bishop e8, and that seems a little bit more solid than what he gets in the game. So f5 was interesting here too, and there's always the possibility of calculating something with f4. It can get really, really sharp. But in the game, so castles, bishop takes h5, bishop d8. The bishop is probably trying to come to a5 here, which would kind of try to dislodge the queen and then potentially play b4 or f5, f4 again. So Magnus plays knight e4, which is logical. The bishop has just left the defense of this pawn, so he goes after it. Bishop f5, and now things get really, really sharp because white can take a second pawn, but he does get pinned. And so at this point, it's really about purely calculating what's happening. Magnus decides that he can take the pawn, and it gets messy. So bishop e7, bishop c5. So the bishop is defending the knight sufficiently, and now the question is what happens in the complications. So I wonder if Gelfand was hoping to play rook a4 here, and perhaps in his calculations he underestimated knight takes f5, and that could be why he went for all of this, possibly. Now, what is this position? It's pretty interesting. That would be a queen sacrifice. In the end, he didn't play rook a4, but here rook takes b4, knight takes e7, knight takes e7. Now, bishop takes b4, taking the rook rather than... If you have a choice between taking a rook and taking a knight, usually you want to take the rook, but taking the knight is not terrible here, although, you know, the position here is better for black than the position he gets after bishop takes b4. So after bishop takes b4, what does white have? They have a rook and a piece, but they do have a bishop pair, and they also have 6 pawns versus 4, so they're up 2 pawns. And it's not easy for black to win this one. You know, this position would probably be just about lost, I would think, because white has 2 rooks. Also, the bishop versus the knight is probably a good thing here. Should be a winning position for white. So black would probably play rook e8, and then white can defend this pawn, say rook to d1. Either rook, I'm not sure which one is better. And this pass pawn looks really strong. So I think, you know, Boris probably just decided that this position was going to be hard to hold and go for the other one. And I do agree that this one doesn't look very pleasant. Doesn't look very pleasant because this passed d pawn looks really strong. If white can just get 2 moves in, play bishop c5 and b4, for example, b4 not b5, you know, the position looks like just dominating. So instead, Boris goes for complication here and plays. Instead of rook a4, he plays bishop h3. And now Magnus makes an interesting decision, because if you're looking at it with the computer likes just playing rook to c1 with the idea that we're defending the bishop, and on rook a4 we can play queen takes b5, and I wonder if Magnus may have missed a tactic. Maybe he saw bishop takes d6 and missed queen takes a4, for example, or something like that. Because this position, winning a second pawn here on b5 doesn't look good for black at all. So it may have been a simpler way to win. And other than rook a4, I don't know what black can do, and it doesn't seem really necessary for white to do anything other than this. But in the game, Magnus plays bishop takes g6, pawn takes g6, and knight e4. And this is interesting because it is a pure exchange sacrifice. However, he does get fascinating, extremely good compensation. He's got a knight on e4 that's extremely strong. He's got a pawn on d5 that's going to be passed. And then this pawn structure for black is really bad, especially for the king, right? The king is never going to be able to feel very safe with a knight that can come to g5. So it's interesting that he went for this because it does look very tempting, very close to winning for white. Just the other one was he was going to actually be up material versus down material. So let's see how the game goes now. He plays bishop takes c5. Rook a4 is worth looking at because it does look like a tricky move. And white can play queen b3 though, and this diagonal is important. That's why Magnus took on g6 first. And then we can play, let's say, rook takes e4. If bishop takes f1, we should probably look at that too. Then I guess the simplest is actually just to take it back. And then on rook takes e4, there's d6. And this position is going to be very good for white because that pawn on, let's say we play, king h7, pawn takes e7. That pawn on e7 is really, really strong. So it's probably just about a winning position here for white. So instead, Boris Gelfand plays bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, bishop takes f1. He's got to try to take material to at least be up something. And now, again, if we count the material, we have a position where white has 6 pawns versus 4, so he has 2 pawns for the exchange and a knight versus a rook. But because of the king safety, it's probably close to winning for white. Not quite winning, but close to winning. What happens? Let's look at a few things here. What happens if rook takes a2? Probably white starts pushing the pawn and says, I don't care too much about my a and b pawns. If black just gets greedy, d7, this pawn is just too fast. We're going to be able to play. The rook is now pretty misplaced. We're going to play, queen d5 and rook d1, and it's going to be hard because the king is also weak. So at some point there'll be knight g5, knight f7, and knight e6. Looks like it's going to be this is going to be a tough one. Not to mention that there could be simply threats to checkmate the king at some point. So he decides, Gelfand decides not to be greedy, and he plays queen to c8. So this is a move that tries to sacrifice another pawn to get active. But Magnus plays the rest of this game actually very, very, very nicely. He gives black really no chance. Queen takes b5, queen g4, queen c4. Queen c4 is a nice move. Can you see the threat here? The threat is to play knight f6 check and take the queen. And it's a bit of an annoying threat to parry. If he plays king h8 to move out here, then probably the pawn just starts running, and there's really no time for black to organize counterplay. Next move is going to be queen d5. It's a little bit similar to the game actually. Finally, of course we would love to play rook c8, but on rook c8 there's knight f6. So after queen c4, black played rook to f4, d6 check, king h8, and queen d5. So this is a nice little sequence because by attacking the rook, he manages to unpin himself, and now the knight will be able to move. Black plays rook f8, d7. He can't really block the pawn here because like if he plays rook d8 now, knight g5 is really strong. That knight is coming to f7 with great effect. We can't take on d7 because of mate. So that king is never going to feel safe with these pawns. And what else? Queen takes d7. The problem is that this rook is hanging here, so we can just trade. So on d7, he plays rook takes e4, and now Magnus gets a position up 2 pawns, and he plays the move queen d1. The rest of the game is very nice technique. He just makes it look so easy. It's not as easy when we have to do it ourselves. Queen d3. Now, with 2 pass pawns on this side, any queen trade, like if black plays this endgame is going to be just completely very easy for Magnus to win this. Probably starting with either rook b1 or rook a1 to put a rook behind the pawn, and then you just start pushing, and it's going to be trivial. So Gelfand tries to keep the queens by playing queen g4. h5, a nice move. He is trying to force a pin like this. If pawn takes rook e1, that rook will fall. So on h5, black plays king h6. Now he plays queen d2 check. Very precise. Now on king takes h5, he can play king g2, and this move is very strong. He threatens rook h1 mate, and not an easy mate to actually stop. And if black plays g5, then the simplest is just to play f3. Now that the g3 pawn is defended, we can win a rook that way. So on h5, on queen d2, he plays g5. Magnus gives another check. King takes h5 and king g2. He's not really threatening f3 here because of rook e2, but he is threatening rook e1. So black plays queen f5 to give a square. Rook h1 check. Rook h4 and queen d1. And so he is going to win the rook now. If he took right away, I think this was actually kind of a trick. There's a bunch of checks here, and it might not be so easy now to win. But so Magnus precise until the end, giving the extra check on d1, and now if the king moves somewhere, now we can actually take without any issue, because on queen e4 we have queen f3 and everything is good. So a very nice game for Magnus. It's interesting that he chose to play this variation, a variation that he faces, that he has faced a lot, with the black pieces. And so always interesting to see how he would play it with white. I'm still curious. I have a few questions for Magnus, which I know Sasha Grischuk was prodding him a little bit in the after the match interview, but Magnus was pretty coy about it. So we'll have to wait for other games to see what Magnus really thinks of some of those ideas. So I hope you enjoyed today's game of the day, and I will see you all tomorrow.